While we've been arguing about whether workers have too much influence, there's another group that's quietly had plenty of it for decades and somehow never gets framed as the problem. The people who design the system, manage it, optimize it, profit from it, brand it with words like efficiency and innovation, then act shocked when regular people feel squeezed by the results. In other words, winners of the modern economy, or if you prefer the classic term, the yuppies. Because if you really want to understand how we ended up with an economy that demands everything from workers while promising just enough to keep them running, you have to go back to the moment we decided this was normal. And yep, it involves Patagonia vests. Picture a familiar scene. A cluster of 20-somethings moving with purpose down a Manhattan sidewalk. Office badges swinging, matching vests stitched with a bank's logo. Maybe you've been stuck behind them while they debate the exact specifications of a drink order. Maybe you've overheard a conversation about Pilates, marathon training, and the unreal short ribs they had last night. We have newer words for this vibe now, but the old one still fits surprisingly well. Yuppies. Yuppie is short for young urban professional, and it really took hold in the 1980s. Back then it meant the rising class of bankers, lawyers, and other credentialed strivers who piled into big cities, earned big paychecks, and bought into a particular lifestyle. Loft apartments, sushi and wine, high-end kitchen gadgets, a kind of polished consumption that signaled you'd made it or were about to. People were fascinated by them, and at the same time disgusted. They were envied, mocked, and blamed. In plenty of cities, anti-yuppie graffiti wasn't subtle. But here's the uncomfortable twist. It's possible we laughed off the yuppies a little too early, because a lot of what feels normal in American professional life today, our obsession with elite credentials, the overwork culture, the self-optimization craze, the foodie arms race, even the way many neighborhoods have changed, was shaped in that yuppie-heavy moment. The 1980s didn't just create a stereotype. They helped lock in a deal that still governs the lives of millions. Work extremely hard, compete relentlessly, and you might win a comfortable life, while the gap between winners and everyone else widens in the background. So where did yuppies come from? They didn't just appear because young people suddenly discovered a love for Chardonnay. They were pulled into existence by an economy being rewired. In the late 70s and 80s, deregulation and political choices helped finance grow in power. Wall Street started capturing a larger share of profits than older industries like manufacturing. Investment banks and big law firms stopped being mere helpers to corporations and increasingly becoming the engines driving corporate decisions, mergers, breakups, takeovers, restructurings, offshoring, the whole machine designed to squeeze short-term value out of legacy companies. And that machine needed labor. Not just a few brilliant masterminds, but armies of young people to do the grinding work. Drafting, proofreading, building documents, checking numbers, reviewing contracts. The professional economy needed foot soldiers. That's why recruiters stormed the campuses of elite universities. The shift was dramatic. At places like Wharton, Yale, and Princeton, Wall Street turned from a niche path into a mass destination. Students lined up in the cold for a shot at interviews. The whole scene started to resemble a funnel. Get into the right school, land the right first job, and maybe you're in. One of the most important parts of this story is who was allowed through that funnel. The traditional pipeline, especially in top schools, couldn't supply enough of the old white upper-class male workforce to staff the booming deal economy. So banks and law firms widened the net. First, more white ethnic groups that had been excluded from the highest status corridors. Then as universities themselves became more diverse, more women and more Black, Latino, and Asian graduates entered these professions in large numbers. In that era's ruthless workplace logic, identity mattered less than pedigree, stamina, and a willingness to hand over your life to the job. A vivid example is Robert Jen, raised in a Chinese immigrant family in New York. He wasn't someone who arrived at college dreaming of junk bonds. He saw a finance executive speak, got pulled in by opportunity and momentum, and wound up on Wall Street almost by accident. That accidental quality matters because it hints at something people often forget. A lot of meritocracy isn't a pure talent contest. It's also timing, recruitment, signals, and a system that steers people once they're near the right doors. But the new, more diverse yuppie workforce didn't necessarily get a better deal. Many were expected to work longer, do narrower tasks, and face thinner odds of reaching the top. Training was often less meaningful. Promotions were harder. As the professional world diversified at the entry level, it also became more intense, and in many cases more miserable. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. Extraction was the point. The leaders of these institutions were building an efficient system for maximum output from ambitious young professionals. And that brings us to one of the biggest Yuppie legacies, the modern credential rat race. When elite universities became the key to elite jobs, the fight to get into those schools escalated. Families began treating admissions like a multi-year campaign. In a society with growing inequality, a spot at the top institution started to look like a ticket. Maybe not to the top 1%, but to a stable upper-middle-class life. And because there were only so many tickets, the competition became zero-sum. Someone's win was someone else's loss. Once inside the professional world, new Yuppies were also sold the story that still dominates today. If you work hard enough, you'll rise. It's an appealing narrative, especially for people breaking barriers. Consider Nancy Lieberman, who graduated from a top law school and joined a fast-rising firm doing mergers and acquisitions. She worked punishing weeks on enormous deals, and she described a culture where what mattered most was performance, the sense that excellence could override sexism, or at least that you could outrun it by being undeniably good. That belief in merit can be empowering. It can also obscure how the structure is designed, not to nurture people, but to use them. What's really striking is how the Yuppie deal spilled over from work into leisure. This was the era when endurance events, especially the marathon, became a kind of status activity for professionals. Not casual jogging for health or peace of mind, but disciplined, scheduled training that looked a lot like career preparation. The logic was familiar. Results matter, excuses don't. Perform or go home. If you're hearing echoes of today's self-tracking culture, wearables, optimization, supplement snacks, you're not imagining it. The Yuppie era planted early seeds of the idea that free time should also be productive. City leadership loved this. Big signature events like the New York City Marathon became advertisements for a reborn urban identity after the crises of the 1970s. The televised image was powerful. A thriving city filled with energetic, white-collar professionals running through the streets like the place was safe, exciting, and open for business. In a sense, cities began planning their futures around attracting and keeping these professionals, paying them well, building housing for them, and creating playgrounds for their tastes. In many places, that dynamic never went away. Food was another arena where Yuppies reshaped culture. The modern foodie identity, where what you eat signals knowledge, sophistication, even morality, didn't come from nowhere. It was fueled by disposable income and a kind of cosmopolitan literacy, knowing which ingredients, cuisines, and restaurants counted as refined. Tools emerged to organize that knowledge, like restaurant guides built for busy professionals. Grocery stores followed the money too, reinventing themselves as upscale experiences, sort of the department store version of a supermarket. And once the market trained people to chase gourmet status, the cycle reinforced itself. Then there's politics. Yuppies didn't just change neighborhoods and brunch menus. They helped shift the Democratic Party. Over time, the party's center of gravity moved away from labor unions and the older New Deal coalition and toward college-educated metropolitan professionals. A different style of liberalism gained power, more faith in technocratic management, innovation, and a high-growth economy, and less emphasis on redistribution or aggressive regulation. The argument was that society should work like the best parts of the professional meritocracy, competitive, efficient, and led by credentialed experts. By the 1990s and beyond, Yuppie money and Yuppie attention became central to national politics. Candidates increasingly needed professional class donors and professional class approval. Wall Street and elite law became major political funding engines. You can draw a line from that transformation to the modern map of American political tension. Dense, high-income urban areas leaning Democratic, many working-class, rural, and post-industrial areas moving away. Of course, the rise of the Yuppie came with a brutal trade-off. Yes, elite spaces became more inclusive in race, gender, and ethnicity than they had been in earlier decades, but mainly for people who could survive the gauntlet. The right schools, the right internships, the right early jobs, the right polish, the right tolerance for long hours and constant evaluation. That selective inclusion had a side effect. It made a rapidly unequal society easier to tolerate because the faces at the top looked more diverse, even as the distance between top and bottom grew. And inequality wasn't abstract. It showed up in the places the Yuppies moved. Across major cities, Yuppie migration was paired with intense gentrification. When higher-income professionals arrived, property values jumped, and landlords had every incentive to renovate, reposition, and replace existing tenants. Sometimes displacement happened politely with buyouts. Often it happened through harassment. And in some of the ugliest cases, it happened through violence, like arson used to clear buildings, leading to deaths and mass displacement. If you want a chilling reminder that neighborhood change isn't always a gentle process, that's it. Many Yuppies still found ways to rationalize what was happening around them. It's a common mental move to treat harm as an unfortunate side effect of progress. You hear versions of it all the time. People say they don't want anyone to suffer. Of course not. They like the neighborhood to be a nicer place. And that word, nicer, often hides what's really being said. Wealthier, whiter, more comfortable for people like me. Over the decades, the industries associated with Yuppies shifted. Finance dominated the 1980s, then consulting surged, then tech took center stage. But the broader pattern accelerated. Professional class wealth rose. Portfolios benefited from the same economic changes that hollowed out other kinds of work, and the distance between people with credentials and people without them grew wider. Eventually, that hierarchy produced resentment. In the 2010s, a strain of populist conservatism positioned itself against almost everything the Yuppie dream represented: diversity initiatives, elite education as a sorting system, globalized finance, cosmopolitan culture, even the idea that cities are the country's moral and cultural center. Some of that backlash was rooted in real economic damage done to working-class communities. Some of it was psychological: humiliation, loss of status, and the feeling of being looked down on by an urban professional class that seemed to write the rules. Race and geography supercharged that resentment, and it wasn't only low-income people who joined it. There were also plenty of locally wealthy, less credentialed business owners, people who felt rich in their towns but dismissed by elite national culture. Into that mix stepped Trump, who had his own long history with the Yuppie world, close enough to it to crave its respect, yet often rejected by it as too brash, too flashy, too outer borough. In politics, that bitterness became fuel, and his aesthetic of contempt lined up neatly with the contempt many supporters felt in return. Here's where the story gets even more complicated. The people we used to call Yuppies are now both dominant and vulnerable. Political attacks on diversity programs and affirmative action threaten the pipeline that helped women and racial minorities enter high-status professions. If formal pathways shrink, hiring can tilt back toward informal networks, connections, nepotism, and subjective fit, which usually favor the already privileged. The professional class could become less open and more inherited, a club where the children of the rich take the seats. And then there's AI. If you want a modern parallel to the descaling and downsizing that reshaped industrial labor in the late 20th century, this might be it. A lot of the entry-level professional work, the kind that used to train young analysts, junior associates, and early career strivers, can be partially automated or radically compressed. If those bottom rungs disappear, what happens to the promise of upward mobility? For many people, even a stable upper-middle-class life could start to look fragile. So what happens if Yuppies, today's version of them, start to feel endangered? One possible outcome is solidarity. If professional workers realize they share insecurity with other workers, not just with the corporate elite above them, coalitions can shift. You can already see hints of this in political alliances that bring together downwardly mobile professionals and working-class strivers, people who are tired of being told to compete with each other while the gains concentrate at the top. An AI-driven shakeup could expand that constituency dramatically. But even for the Yuppies who won, the story has never been purely triumphant. The meritocratic grind that paid for the apartment, the schooling, the lifestyle, it carried a psychological bill. Long hours, constant judgment, the pressure to keep climbing, the sense that if you stop running, you fall behind. A lot of people didn't feel victorious. They felt exhausted, burned out, like the prize kept moving. In a way, Yuppies were the first young cohorts pulled deeply into what you might call the sweatshop of meritocracy, a system that produces comfort for some by demanding relentless labor, constant self-management, and an acceptance of broader inequality as the background condition of success. And that leaves us with a final question worth sitting with. If a class identity like the Yuppie could be built through policy, economics, culture, and institutions, can it also be dismantled or reshaped? Maybe the real task now is to renegotiate the bargain, to keep what was genuinely good about opening doors and expanding opportunity, without accepting exploitation, burnout, and widening inequality as the necessary price. History suggests nothing about this arrangement is permanent. If it was made, it can be unmade.